Opening statements are set for later today in the murder trial of Derek Medina, the man dubbed the Facebook Killer.
Most people who commit murder spend the rest of their lives trying to hide it. This man did the opposite. Within minutes of killing his wife in their own kitchen, he picked up his phone and told the internet exactly what he'd done, in his own words with a photograph attached. Friends who saw it thought it had to be a joke. It wasn't. Upstairs, a 10-year-old girl had no idea any of this was happening. Tonight we're breaking down how a man who built his entire online identity around teaching other people how to save their marriages ended up becoming one of the most infamous killers of the social media age. And how the very post he thought would explain himself is what sealed his fate in court. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if true crime like this keeps you hooked, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss next case. A husband promises his wife he will wake up early so they can watch a movie together before the day starts. He sleeps through it. That single broken promise, nothing more than an ordinary morning failure, is the first domino in a chain that ends with a woman dead on her own kitchen floor, and a photograph of her body circulating on the internet before her own daughter has even been told what happened. It sounds impossible that something so small could end in something so large. But small failures do not cause murders on their own. They only expose what was already sitting underneath, loaded and waiting. This is the story of a man who spent years building an online identity as a healer, an author, and a communicator, and who used the very platform he had built that identity on to broadcast the one thing he could never take back. It is a story about a woman who had already decided to leave and told her friends so, about a 10-year-old girl left alone in a house with unimaginable silence, and about a killing that became infamous not because of how it happened, but because of what came seconds after. This is the case of Derek Medina and Jennifer Alfonso, the murder the world would come to know through a single Facebook post. Derek Medina was born in 1982 and raised in South Florida, the son of Derek Medina Sr. By his early 30s, he had constructed a public persona almost entirely online, long before that kind of self-branding was common. He worked as a property management supervisor at a gated condominium complex in Coral Gables, but his real energy went into a separate identity he built for himself on the internet. Medina described himself as an actor, claiming a background appearance on the Miami-based crime drama Burn Notice, though no formal screen credit for him has ever surfaced. He posted videos of himself kickboxing, sailing, singing, and posing with celebrities, cultivating the image of a man who was active, spiritual, and endlessly self-improved. He wrote and self-published 6 e-books, most of them centered on spirituality, ghost encounters, and emotional healing. Titles ranged from accounts of supernatural experiences to a 41-page guide called How I Saved Someone's Life and Marriage and Family Problems Through Communication, a book in which Medina positioned himself as an authority on saving relationships through honest dialogue. He maintained a personal website advertising the books as tools that could change a reader's life in seconds. Friends and acquaintances who encountered Medina online largely saw a man who appeared upbeat, spiritually engaged, and eager to present himself as someone with answers. Underneath that curated surface, according to those closest to the marriage, was a relationship that cycled through periods of real instability. Jennifer Alfonso was 26 years old, a mother already raising a daughter from a previous relationship by the time she and Medina were together. Those who knew her described a woman who was warm and full of life, someone with, in her own mother's later words, so much to give. She was close with her family and confided in friends about the state of her marriage, including her plans to eventually leave it. Alfonso worked and lived a fairly ordinary South Florida life outside of the relationship that would come to define how the world remembered her, raising her daughter and managing a household inside a modest South Miami townhouse that she and Medina shared. Medina and Alfonso's relationship followed an unusual and turbulent pattern almost from the start, Public records show the two first married in January 2010. Barely 2 years later, in February 2012, they divorced. Then, only 3 months after that divorce was finalized, they remarried in April 2012. Medina's own father would later admit to reporters that the couple had experienced ongoing difficulties throughout their time together, describing a relationship that always had some kind of problem running underneath it. That same year, Medina purchased the couple's condominium unit outright for just over $100,000, tying the family more permanently to the South Miami townhouse where the marriage would ultimately end. On paper, the remarriage looked like a fresh start. In practice, according to prosecutors who would later reconstruct the relationship for a jury, Medina had made it clear he did not intend to let his wife leave a second time. Evidence presented at trial indicated Medina had told people close to him that he would kill Alfonso if she ever tried to walk away from the marriage for good. Alfonso, for her part, had already begun quietly telling friends that she planned to do exactly that. The morning of August 8, 2013, began with nothing more dramatic than a broken promise. Medina had told Alfonso the night before that he would wake up early with her to watch a movie together, a small shared ritual. He did not wake up. When Alfonso confronted him about it in their upstairs bedroom, the disagreement escalated quickly, the way arguments do when they are carrying more weight than the immediate issue can explain. Alfonso, frustrated, threw mascara containers and towels at her husband. Medina responded by drawing a handgun and pointing it directly at her, there in their bedroom. He did not fire it. For reasons that were never fully explained in court, the confrontation paused there, and the gun stayed silent for the moment. In the middle of that same tense morning, before anything turned physical, Alfonso reached out to a friend by text message, venting about the frustration building inside the house. She wrote that she felt like ripping Medina's face off and that she was about to explode over how he was treating her, then added, almost gently, that all she really wanted was to spend time with him, that she was not going to beg for it. It is a small, human detail buried inside a case that would soon be reduced to a single viral photograph. A young woman irritated with her husband on an ordinary morning, still hopping for connection rather than confrontation, with no idea what the day would become. The fight did not end. It moved downstairs into the kitchen, where a portion of what followed was captured on one of the home's internal security cameras. It was in the kitchen that Alfonso, by now at what witnesses and prosecutors described as a breaking point, told Medina directly that she was leaving him, a plan she had already shared with people outside the marriage. Somewhere in the exchange, Alfonso grabbed a large kitchen knife. Medina would later tell police that disarming her was simple, that he took the knife away from her without much difficulty and put it in a drawer. It was what he did immediately afterward that would become the case's central and most damning detail. Rather than staying downstairs with his now unarmed wife and letting the argument cool, Medina walked back upstairs, retrieved the handgun he had already pointed at her once that morning, and carried it back down to the kitchen. According to Medina's own recorded statement to police, he shot Alfonso because she continued coming at him with her fists even after the knife had been taken away, and he described years of physical abuse at her hands as the backdrop for what he did next. He fired 8 times. The forensic evidence told a different story than the one he gave investigators. A medical examiner who reviewed the wounds testified that every one of the 8 gunshots had entered Alfonso's body at a downward angle. That single detail, the trajectory of the bullets, dismantled the image of a standing confrontation between two people of roughly equal footing. The downward angle, combined with the position in which Alfonso's body was found on the kitchen floor, her knees bent beneath her, her legs folded back to the side, indicated that she had not been standing and swinging her fists when the shots were fired. She had been on her knees. Prosecutors would later describe her as cornered in the small kitchen, not fighting from a position of aggression, but from one of retreat. The disparity between the two people in that kitchen was not subtle. Medina stood roughly 6 feet tall and weighed close to 200 pounds. Alfonso was 5'6". Prosecutors made a point during trial of emphasizing that a man with that kind of physical advantage over his wife had no plausible need to introduce a firearm into a domestic argument at all, let alone fire it 8 times into a woman who, by the physical evidence, was already on the ground. Upstairs, in a bedroom removed from the kitchen, Alfonso's 10-year-old daughter from a previous relationship was in the house the entire time. She did not witness the shooting and did not discover her mother's body. What happened next revealed something about Medina's priorities in the minutes after the shooting. He did not call for help. He did not check on the child. Instead, at around 11 in the morning, Medina picked up his phone, opened Facebook, and began typing. He posted a message telling his online followers that he expected to go to prison, framing the killing as a final response to years of abuse he claimed to have suffered, and saying his goodbyes to friends on the platform. Moments later, he followed the text with a photograph, a picture of Alfonso's body on the kitchen floor, dressed in a black outfit, blood visible on her arm and face, captioned with her name and the letters commonly used online to mark a death. Friends who saw the post responded in disbelief, asking Medina directly what had happened. The photograph and the accompanying confession remained visible on Facebook for more than 5 hours before the platform removed the page. Only after posting the image did Medina leave the house. He locked the door behind him, leaving the 10-year-old girl alone inside with her mother's body downstairs, and drove first to his father's home, where he confessed to what he had done, and then to a police station, where the two of them went together so Medina could turn himself in. Investigators, arriving at the townhouse, found Alfonso's body in the kitchen and located the girl unharmed inside, quickly removing her from the scene. She would later be confirmed to have been in an upstairs bedroom the entire time, spared from witnessing the act itself, but not from what came after, hours alone in a house that had just become a crime scene. Medina was arrested and initially charged with first-degree murder. During the subsequent investigation, officers seized 2 cell phones, 3 computers, and an iPad from the townhouse, digging into Medina's extensive online footprint, the e-books, the videos, the years of curated self-presentation as a man devoted to healing broken relationships through communication. At trial, the defense attempted to introduce evidence that Alfonso had a history of drug use and sought to bring in expert testimony, arguing that Medina himself was a victim of what is sometimes called battered spouse syndrome, suffering ongoing abuse at his wife's hands that culminated in the shooting. The presiding judge, Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Yvonne Kolodny, ruled against allowing several pieces of that proposed defense evidence, including the abuse syndrome testimony, to go before the jury. Medina did not take the stand in his own defense. Jurors instead heard his account through a 28-minute videotaped statement he had given to police shortly after his arrest, in which he described disarming Alfonso and then shooting her only after she resumed hitting him, insisting at one point that she had been trying to take him out. The defense also attempted to introduce 2 unusual pieces of evidence that the court ultimately excluded: an expert who claimed to identify 2 upright figures fighting in the reflection captured on the kitchen's stainless steel sink, and an argument that Alfonso had been under the influence of synthetic drugs, so-called bath salts, at the time of the confrontation, along with unsubstantiated claims about her involvement in occult practices. None of it was allowed before the jury. The prosecution's closing argument painted a starkly different picture from the one Medina had given police, describing a woman who was likely cowering on her knees when Medina fired, not lunging or striking. Prosecutor Lee Klein told jurors plainly that Medina had planned to execute his wife and had carried that plan out. Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle would later put it even more bluntly in a public statement, saying the evidence showed Medina had coldly murdered his wife to heal his own injured ego. After more than 2 weeks of testimony and roughly 6 hours of deliberation across 2 days, the jury rejected Medina's self-defense claim. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, along with the illegal discharge of a firearm inside a dwelling and child neglect, the latter charge tied directly to leaving Alfonso's daughter alone in the house for hours after the shooting. Medina showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read and was led back into custody. His attorney told reporters outside the courtroom that an appeal would follow, maintaining that the defense still believed this had been a case of self-defense, even if the jury had not agreed. At sentencing, Judge Kolodny handed down the maximum penalty available, life in prison for the murder itself, along with a consecutive 15-year sentence for discharging the firearm inside the home and a consecutive 5-year sentence for child neglect. Referring back to Medina's own Facebook post, the one in which he had written that he expected to go to prison, Kolodny told him directly that he had foretold his own future, and that his future was now exactly where he had said it would be. Under the terms of the sentence, Medina would need to serve a minimum of 25 years before he could even become eligible to apply for parole. Given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Medina offered a rambling, unfocused statement. He did not apologize. Instead, he urged then-President Barack Obama to fight corruption and stated that God knew the truth of what had happened. Alfonso's family, several of whom addressed the court and urged the judge toward the maximum sentence, pushed back hard against any narrative that reduced Jennifer Alfonso to a crime scene photograph. Her mother, Carolyn Knox, told the court that her daughter had not simply been a body on the floor to be discovered, that she had been a wonderful, amazing person with so much still left to give, and that all of it was now gone. True to his attorney's word, Medina pursued an appeal, and in November 2018, Florida's 3rd District Court of Appeal issued its ruling. The appellate panel rejected every argument Medina raised, upholding the trial court's decision to keep the battered spouse testimony and the bath salts and occult claims away from the jury, and affirming both the conviction and the sentence in full. Years later, from inside a Florida prison, Medina gave an interview in which he continued to maintain that he had not received a fair trial and that he still did not consider himself guilty of the crime he had already spent years imprisoned for, a position he has held onto consistently since the moment he first spoke to police. Technical analysis. From a forensic standpoint, this case turned almost entirely on a single measurable detail, the angle of entry on 8 gunshot wounds. A downward trajectory across all 8 shots is not consistent with a shooter firing at a target who is upright and actively striking him with closed fists, the account Medina gave police. It is consistent with a shooter standing over a target who is lower to the ground, whether kneeling, crouching, or attempting to shield herself. Paired with the position in which Alfonso's body came to rest, knees bent beneath her, legs folded to the side rather than sprawled from a standing collapse, the physical evidence painted a picture of a woman who was already down, already cornered, when the shots were fired. That is the kind of detail a jury does not need an expert to translate into plain meaning. It converts a claim of mutual physical struggle into something closer to an execution. The home security footage, which captured part of the kitchen argument, gave investigators and prosecutors a rare advantage most domestic homicide cases do not have: a partial visual record of the escalation itself, reducing the case to a matter of connecting documented movement to physical outcome rather than relying purely on competing verbal accounts. And then there is the detail that exists entirely outside of traditional forensics: the Facebook post and photograph themselves. In effect, Medina's own real-time documentation of the immediate aftermath functioned as a spontaneous, uncoerced confession, complete with a timestamp, sent out to dozens of witnesses before police had even been notified. Few killers provide investigators with an unprompted broadcast confirming their own guilt within minutes of the act. It is also worth noting what the defense tried and failed to introduce as evidence, since the exclusion itself says something about how thin the counter-narrative was. An expert witness proposing that two upright, actively struggling figures could be identified in the blurred reflection of a stainless steel sink is not standard forensic methodology. It is an attempt to manufacture ambiguity where the physical evidence, the angle of the wounds and the position of the body, left very little room for it. Courts exclude that kind of testimony because it does not meet the reliability threshold expected of expert forensic opinion, and its rejection here left the downward trajectory of the gunshots as the only physical narrative the jury had to work with. Psychological analysis. What makes this case difficult to file into a simple category is the sheer distance between the identity Medina had built for public consumption and the act he committed in private. Here was a man who spent real time and effort authoring guidance material on communication, healing, and saving marriages. Someone who wanted, at least outwardly, to be seen as a source of wisdom for other people's relationship struggles. That kind of persistent self-mythologizing, presenting himself repeatedly as an author, a healer, an emotionally evolved figure, suggests an image of self that was carefully maintained, and perhaps increasingly disconnected from what was actually happening inside his own home. The gap between the man writing 41 pages about the importance of honest communication and the man who chose a firearm over a conversation is worth sitting with. His insistence, both in his police statement and later at sentencing, on a narrative of long-standing victimization at his wife's hands reads as an attempt to reframe the encounter after the fact, to recast himself as the one who had endured rather than the one who had ended a life. The decision to document the immediate aftermath rather than seek help says something about where his instincts went first in a moment of crisis, toward audience and narrative control rather than toward remorse or damage limitation. Even his final statement to the court, refusing to apologize and instead pivoting to unrelated claims about corruption and divine truth, suggests a continued need to position himself as a misunderstood figure operating on a different moral plane than the one the courtroom was judging him by, rather than someone reckoning honestly with what the evidence had already proven. The state attorney's public description of the killing as an act meant to heal an injured ego is worth taking seriously as a psychological frame, not just a rhetorical flourish. A man who had spent years constructing an identity as someone with wisdom to offer other struggling couples was, in that same period, apparently unable to tolerate the idea of his own wife choosing to leave him. The murder, read that way, was not simply the end point of a single heated argument, but the violent reassertion of control by someone whose sense of self depended heavily on being seen as the one with answers, the one holding the relationship together, rather than the one being left behind. That his denial has persisted for years afterward, surviving an appellate loss and a life sentence without ever cracking into acknowledgement, points to a self-image so tightly held that even overwhelming physical evidence has not been enough to dislodge it. The communication irony. Of everything strange and unsettling about this case, the detail that lingers longest is the one Medina wrote himself, years before the murder, without knowing it would ever be read this way. He built an entire secondary identity around teaching other people how to save their marriages through honest, direct communication, publishing his ideas under his own name for anyone to find. When his own marriage reached its breaking point, he did not talk. He retrieved a weapon twice in the same morning, the second time after the immediate danger had already been removed from the room. The very same instinct that made him document his life so publicly online, the instinct that produced 6 self-published books and years of shared videos and photos, is the instinct that turned against him in the worst possible way, when he chose to photograph his wife's body and confess to killing her in the same breath, in front of an audience of friends and family, before a single investigator had been called. He spent years trying to build a reputation as a man with answers about how to keep a family together. In the end, The words he was most remembered for were the ones a judge read back to him at sentencing, his own prediction of the prison sentence he had handed himself, typed out in a Facebook post before the blood on his wife's body had even dried. There is a second layer to that irony worth nomming directly. Medina did not merely fail to communicate in the moment his marriage most needed it. He had spent years telling strangers on the internet that he held the secret to saving relationships other people could not save themselves, while the relationship closest to him quietly deteriorated behind that curated front. The books, the videos, the ghost hunting stories, the celebrity photos, all of it built outward, toward an audience, while almost nothing seems to have been invested in the private, unglamorous work an actual marriage in crisis required. When the crisis finally arrived in its most extreme form, his instinct was still to reach for that audience first, camera in hand, before he ever reached for a phone to call for help. The case also arrived at a specific moment in internet history, early enough that platforms like Facebook had not yet built the moderation infrastructure to catch and remove this kind of content quickly, which is part of why the photograph was able to circulate for roughly 5 hours before it was taken down. That delay became its own point of public debate afterward, about what responsibility social media companies carried for content posted in real time by users, a conversation this case is often credited with helping to accelerate. In that sense, Jennifer Alfonso's death did not only end in a courtroom. It became, unwillingly, one of the earlier test cases for how the internet would eventually have to reckon with violence broadcast live by the people committing it. Jennifer Alfonso's daughter grew up carrying the aftermath of a crime she never witnessed, but could never fully escape, a mother taken from her in the next room, and a case that became a fixture of early social media era true crime coverage largely because of what her stepfather chose to do with a phone in his hand. Derek Medina remains in Florida prison custody, ineligible for parole consideration until at least 2038, still insisting from behind bars that the trial that convicted him was unfair, having authored, in the end, only one story the world would remember him for: